Well, welcome everyone, wherever you are, whatever time it is. It's a very great joy today to have as our speaker and introducing a fantastic text, Professor Emerita Joanna Weinberg. She was Professor of Early Modern Jewish History and Rabbinics, a great authority on Renaissance Judaism, on medieval Judaism, and many other things. And I know her best from her wonderful translation of Azariah de Rossi's Light of the Eyes. And I'd just like to quote what Anthony Grafton, and you couldn't have a better commentator or more authoritative word from anyone. He says, this translation by Joanna is one of the most important contributions of the past generation, both to the study of Jewish thought in the 16th century and to that of the history of historical scholarship. So we're going to hear about another aspect of Azariah de Rossi, one of the most remarkable people of the 16th century. So over to you, Joanna, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Sebastian, for that introduction. Thank you, Thea, for having organized the event. And let me thank Sebastian yet again, because what I'm going to be talking about is very much something connected with a topic that he helped me with. And had it not been for his help, I don't think it would have materialized in the way it did. So I must put that on record. In November 1570, a devastating earthquake struck the city of Ferrara in Italy. Conspicuous among the many and diverse reporters on this natural disaster was Azariah de Rossi, the Jewish scholar from Mantua. His description of and reflections on this natural disaster were inserted into the first section of his monumental work of historiography, The Light of the Eyes. It was published in Mantua 1573-5. At the end of his narration, he related an anecdote of fundamental importance for his work and indeed for the history of scholarship. And if you look at text 1 now, that's what I'll be reading out. During this frightening time in which, as I said, I was forced to leave the ruins of my home and take up my abode wherever I could, my lot fell in with many peace-loving people south of the River Po. One of our neighbors, a Christian scholar, to pass the time and divert his mind from the distressing earthquake, was enjoying himself by reading the book which I had begun to discuss with him. It relates the story of the translation of our Torah, that is, the letter of Aristeas. It was at this time that he came up to greet me and then inquired whether by means of the Hebrew version, for he thought we Jews possessed the book, I could clarify and elucidate some of the passages he found obscure in the Latin, a language with which he had been conversant for a long time. When I informed him that we had no such thing, he was utterly amazed as how such glory could depart from Israel, who could deservedly win great prestige from it. I was unoccupied at the time, being far away from my books and delightful pleasures. I lifted my eyes to the mountains to see whether they would skip like rams, and to the walls should they move. That man, together with the distinguished persons with whom I was associated there, encouraged me to produce a translation of the book in a few days. They told me it would divert my attention from the terror of the earthquake and bring solace in these distressing times, as if one were to draw honey from a goat and wheat from a thorn. So I did not refuse my heart's desire, since there was a likelihood that this work would be totally acceptable to the learned of our people. Well, these were the circumstances, at least according to de Rossi. Obviously, this is a very stylized story, and one may suspect some of the details in which he gives us. But it's a story in which he produced about his production of the first Hebrew annotated translation of the letter of Aristeas, the work that purports to describe the origins of the Greek translation of the Bible, executed, according to the story, by 72 Jewish elders, whom Eleazar, the high priest in Jerusalem, sent to the monarch Ptolemy Philadelphus in Alexandria. Yet we perhaps should not take de Rossi at his word, for it's clear that when he undertook to translate Matthias Gabitius's 1561 Latin rendering of the original Greek text of the Later Varistias, it signified rather more than a diversion and a solace. Indeed, de Rossi's Hebrew translation constituted the basis for the pioneering and fascinating discussion of Hellenistic Jewish history contained in his Light of the Eyes. In particular, it served as a crucial starting point for his disquisition on the discrepancies between the Hebrew and Greek Bibles, or rather Pentateuch. According to de Rossi, the 72 elders translated the text of the Pentateuch from not from Hebrew, but from one of the many unvocalized Aramaic versions that circulated in those times. By positing the original thesis that the almost sacred version of the Bible, namely the Septuagint, was translated from a less than reliable rendition of the biblical text, de Rossi was entering rather challenging territory. We note his courage, which, as we will see, seems to know no limits. In short, we see that the polymath Azariah was confronting an issue that in the late 16th century was fast becoming a major preoccupation for Christian scholars of all denominations, namely the authority of the different versions of the Bible. The declaration at the Council of Trent in 1546 that the ancient and widely current tradition that had been approved by long use within the church for so many centuries should be held as authentic was not the last word on the matter. Various attempts had been made over the years to prepare a new edition of the Vulgate, purge of errors. Although attention was transferred from the Vulgate to the Septuagint during the pontificate of Gregory XIII, the project remained high on the ecclesiastical agenda throughout the last decades of the 16th century and well into the 17th. Now, whereas de Rossi wrote his Light of the Eyes in Hebrew, ostensibly for a Jewish readership, although, of course, many scholars of the late 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries read it quite carefully, translated sections of the book. In the last years of his life, he decided, or rather was requested, to write in Italian for Christians. Writing under his Italian name, Buon Aiuto, a nice translation of the Hebrew name Azariah, he wrote his observations on the Syriac New Testament to prove that certain passages in the New Testament ought to be amended on the basis of the ancient Syriac rendering. The manuscript, his manuscript, is extant in two versions, both in his own hand. And as Sebastian suggested, I published the text in 2005. The earlier version had been dedicated to Giacomo Boncompagni, the Governor General of the Church, who had already requested de Rossi to provide him with a translation of one of the chapters in his Light of the Eyes. The second, almost identical copy was dedicated to the Cardinal of Santa Severina, Giulio Antonio Santoro, and we'll come back to him later on in this talk. Now, de Rossi introduced his monograph on the Syriac Gospels in the following manner. So if you please look at text 2. In the name of your most illustrious worship, I have been requested, and as your devoted servant do I willingly obey, to explain how Jews understand the so-called Hebrew words in the Gospels. In the first place, I must tell you that although called Hebrew, these words are actually Syriac, Aramaic. For in those days, apart from the Mosaic tongue, which the teachers of the law in particular knew, the popular Jewish language was Syriac, i.e. Aramaic. It was the language of the law court, and it was their vernacular which they had brought back with them from Babylon. Now, since that language is still widely known, although written in Hebrew characters, I shall not refrain from complying with the wishes of your most illustrious lordship to the best of my ability. I should inform you that to my great delight, I was given the opportunity to serve you in the best way possible when I came across a copy of the Gospels, which had been published in Vienna, Austria, in the year 1555, under the patronage of the divine Emperor Ferdinand of blessed memory, who is the fount of religion and clemency. He authorized a most learned scholar, a chancellor at the imperial court, to publish the text in the Syriac language, using its own characters, which are very different from ours, i.e. from Hebrew characters. In his fine prologue and in other passages, the senator claims that it is not a modern rendering, but a text, or rather an ancient translation, which dates back to the early evangelical period. In his introduction to Matthew, he says, "The Holy Emperor facilitated the publication of the Gospel from two very old manuscripts written in the Syriac language and Christ's vernacular, which was repeatedly called Hebrew by the evangelists." What is striking here is that de Rossi claims to have been commissioned to write this monograph on the Aramaisms of the New Testament by high Christian authorities. The raison d'etre for the work, he suggests, is the fact that he is a Jew who knows his Aramaic. It should be noted here that for most European Orientalists were unable to perceive any grammatical or lexical difference between Syriac and Aramaic. Again, he writes as though nothing was planned. He says he came across a copy of the Gospels which had been published in Vienna in the year 1555. This was actually the first printed edition of the Syriac New Testament. The editor, Johann Albrecht Widmanstätter, had been initiated in the study of Syriac by Tesio Ambrogio, who himself was the author of a bizarre, confused and confusing, at least I think, introduction to Syriac, Aramaic, Armenian, and 10 other languages in Pavia in 1539. In it, he had described how during the Fifth Lateran Council, Pope Leo X had asked him to examine the Syriac liturgy presented by 3 Maronites who had arrived in Rome. He didn't know Syriac, and he got the help of others to help him. Widmanstätter was also aided by Postel, the strange but very erudite scholar, who also wrote a book on various Oriental language. And he had acquired manuscripts of the Syriac Gospels during his journeys to the east. It was, however, the Jacobite monk, Moses of Mardin, who played the key role in Widmanstätter's Syriac edition, which was, as de Rossi pointed out, produced under the auspices of Ferdinand I. 1,000 copies were printed, 500 of which were set aside for use by the Jacobite Church. Now, de Rossi alleges that he wrote his tract on the Syriac New Testament by request of the Governor General of the Church. By a stroke of good luck, he had come across Widmanstätter's monumental edition of the Syriac New Testament, printed in Vienna. Following Widmanstätter's appraisal of the Peshitta as an important and early witness of the text of the New Testament, he, Buonaiuto Ebreo, Azariah the Jew, would now give the authoritative last word on the correct reading of the Christian scriptures by means of an analysis of the Syriac text. This, in brief, is the way de Rossi accounted for his study of the Syriac Gospels in 1577. But on a close examination of de Rossi's life and works, we might construe the course of events slightly differently. Although I must admit that the overall assessment of de Rossi's pioneering contribution, because it was a pioneering contribution to Syriac studies in the West, will not substantially change. De Rossi's interest in Syriac predated his commission to write on the Syriac Gospels. In 1574, de Rossi, like many of his contemporaries, composed eulogies in Hebrew, Aramaic, Latin, and Italian to commemorate the death of Margherita di Savoia, the patron of arts and protectress of the underdog Valdensians and the Jews. She prevented Jews from being exiled from various regions that her husband, Emanuel Filiberto, had dominion over. True to his scholarly vocation, de Rossi furnished these poems with a commentary. With regard to one of the Aramaic poems, which contained the biblical phrase, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me, he wrote, Since these words are in the Syriac tongue, they should not be written in Hebrew characters, but in the Syriac script. And here in that poem, he actually produces the text in Syriac characters. For these are exactly the same words found in the Gospel text, which was published for the benefit of Syriac Christians dispersed widely about the East. The publication was facilitated by the Holy Emperor Ferdinand of blessed memory, most clement Lord and Majesty. Under his patronage and with ample privilege, the Senator Johannes Albert, that's Widmanstädter, published the text in Vienna in the year 1505 in the Syriac tongue and script, which was most certainly also the vernacular for those Jews who became Christians at the time of the Second Temple. But because the script is unknown in these parts, we have set it down in Hebrew characters, since many people are familiar with that script. So thus we hear testimony from the horse's mouth that already in 1574, so 3 years before he wrote the work on the Syriac Gospels, if not earlier, that he owned or had read Widmanstädter's Peshitta and was familiar with the Syriac Certo alphabet. Moreover, in his magnum opus, in his Light of the Eyes, printed between 1573 and 5, but clearly the product of a lifetime's absorption in some of the major scholarly issues of the day, he made several references to Tesio Ambrogio's introduction to Syriac, and as I said, devoted some central sections of the book to questions of language, in particular relating to the translation of the Septuagint and the linguistic situation pertaining to Jews in the time of Jesus. So we see then that the study of Syriac was on de Rossi's scholarly agenda sometime before he wrote his treatise on the Syriac New Testament. De Rossi's scholarly reputation must have gone before him. This is made clear not only by his prefatory letters to Giacomo Boncompagni and to the Cardinal of Santa Severina, but also from one other document appended to the manuscript of the observations on the Syriac New Testament. It is an amazing letter written by the Inquisitor of Ferrara and addressed to the Cardinal of Santa Severina. In it, we learn that the Inquisitor had attempted to convert the Jew Buonaiuto de Rossi, whom he described as physically very ugly, but intellectually brilliant. His exhortations that had continued over a period of 2 years, that is from 1573 to 1575, had fallen on deaf ears. The letter was intended to present de Rossi's own view of the matter. The cardinal was not to interpret his adamant refusal to convert as indication of his religious bigotry. He was not a pazzo ebreo, a fanatical Jew who was unable to speak favorably of other religions. His recent work on the Gospels, a copy of which he had recently sent to the cardinal, was surely compelling evidence as to his open-mindedness in religious matters. Now, we should bear in mind that de Rossi was dealing here with one of the powerful figures of Gregory XIII's papacy. The Cardinal of Santa Severina, or Giulio Santoro, to whom the Inquisitor was responsible, held the office of Iudex Sacrae Inquisitionis. With Guglielmo Sileto, he headed the College of Neophytes, and he was also involved in the censorship of Hebrew books. Moreover, as Giorgio Levi della Vida taught us so many years ago, Santoro was protector of the Christian communities of the East and deeply engaged in achieving union between the Eastern and Western churches. Discretion and careful instruction characterizes the continuation of the introduction. So please, if you look at text 3 now. Now, since this Syriac text was extolled for its antiquity and precision, it may be used to the great pleasure of noble souls for the clarification of certain passages, which undoubtedly merit consideration. At the same time, some errors of certain learned commentators will, with respect, be disclosed. By a stroke of good luck, I came across an introduction to different languages, focusing in particular on Syriac, which gives a fine presentation of the scripts. Thanks be to God, I'd already had knowledge of the Syriac language when reproduced in Mosaic script, i.e. he's talking about Aramaic, and I'm therefore able to read it proficiently in its own characters. You see, he doesn't make any differentiation between Aramaic and Syriac. To good purpose and for the greater contentment of your most illustrious worship, I shall register the actual Syriac words in their own script as given in the book for each of the cited passages, and then transcribe them in both the Italian script and the Hebrew one now in use. Finally, those Syriac words will be faithfully translated into the vernacular one by one, so that their real meaning becomes evident. The Italian text will be written in a different color, ink, i.e. red, so that despite its submersion amidst alien lines, your most illustrious worship can easily detect it. And if you desire, you can compare it with the Latin text under consideration. I can assure you that quite apart from a certain enjoyment that you will experience, the clarification of the meaning of the text has obvious usefulness. Moreover, there's no doubt that with such subjects, one iota elucidated is more precious to devout Christians than complete tomes of any other treatise. I shall also render those Syriac words in the Mosaic script and tongue that we call the Holy Tongue, and which was also celebrated by St. Augustine in the 3rd and 11th chapter of Book 16 of the City of God. It is not that the Gospels were originally written in that language and script. Rather, I deem it important to demonstrate how, if that had been the case, those words would have been spoken and written. By means of such a comparison, it becomes apparent that the designation in Hebrew applied to them can only signify the Syriac Aramaic language, which they too use, in fact, with even greater frequency, as we said before. These discussions will also enable us to broach other considerations which are not without value. This usually happens when intellects are united in their thought and therefore stimulate each other. I'm now ready to begin. I'm certainly convinced that I should never be the object of any criticism, either by judicious Christians or by suspicious Jews for such a work. With the wise Ecclesiastes, I can say, Ani pi melech shemo. This is Kohelet, Ecclesiastes 8:2, which in substance, he translates it in his own way, I am observing the king's commandment by producing something which is certainly both permitted and virtuous. So not only do we get a succinct guide to the book and made to feel that we are in the hands of an expert, but we are also really feel that he is really very much on the defensive. We are reminded as well that he had read Tesio Ambrogio's introduction to Syriac, but he doesn't even mention him by name. In particular, he shows empathy for his Christian readers who are supposed to appreciate his interpretation of their sacred text. De Rossi must have been only too aware that he was negotiating with the supreme powers in the land, and he must have been totally cognizant of their preoccupation to control the diverse religious communities that live within their ambit or beyond. Indeed, we can see how carefully he couched his addresses to these ecclesiastical authorities. His intellectual legacy is therefore to be retrieved from two distinct contexts, both of which shaped his identity and brought about his own self-fashioning, conscious as he was of living in two worlds. Even before he had been submitted to conversionary pressure in the Catholic world, the Catholic world had not been completely out of bounds for him. He visited a Benedictine monastery, the Abbazia di Polirone in Mantua, and from the Syriac tract, it's clear that he visited churches, for he shows familiarity with images of the crucifixion with the titulus crucis. He had to submit himself, or rather address himself, to two authorities. There was the rabbinic establishment, which would already give him a lot of trouble about his book, The Light of the Eyes. It was a question whether the book should be banned, and the sort of ban hovered over it, not only in his own time, but for centuries to come. And on the other hand, of course, there were the ecclesiastical powers, the powers that were trying to convert him. This consciousness is eloquently expressed then in the opening remarks, when he says, "I am indeed convinced that I do not deserve to be persecuted either by critical Christians or by suspicious Jews for such a work. With the wise Ecclesiastes, I can say, Ani pi melech shema, which in substance means I am observing the king's commandment by producing something which is indeed permitted and virtuous." The enigmatic biblical phrase is exploited by de Rossi here to the full. He is a committed Jew and fully observing the commandments of the divine king. But he's also saying, I think, that he's deserving of the approval of the human sovereign, in this case, the cardinal. By means of the double entendre, de Rossi articulated the perilous nature of his endeavor. His fellow Jews might misinterpret his foray into Christian scholarship as indication of his religious proclivities, while he risked raising the ire of Christians by suggesting that their holy scripture, namely the Vulgate, needed some revision. Artful as he undoubtedly was in plying his trade and aware of the differing sensibilities of either authority, the self he fashions in both contexts remains consistent. It is as an unrepentant seeker of the truth that he portrays himself, whether addressing Christians or Jews. And the truth that he seeks does not concern facile matters, rather and this is what is particularly significant, de Rossi constantly exposed himself to criticism, who chose to apply his intellectual powers to notably sensitive issues. In the case of the Syriac work, the errors or incorrect interpretation of the Christian scriptures. Now, the purpose of de Rossi's Italian work then was to explain to Christians the correct meaning of some key expressions in the Gospels, which had become corrupt or obscure, particularly the Aramaic words, Jesus' ipsissima verba, which had often been described erroneously as Hebrew. He presented the ancient Syriac version of the New Testament as an authentic witness, which preserved the original readings of the sacred text and therefore could be used to correct or interpret the Vulgate. This was a pious duty, as he states in his prefatory letter. There is no doubt that in such subjects, one iota clarified is of greater value to religious Christians than the entire text of any other tract. It was a delicate task, given the importance and priority attributed to the Vulgate, as I said, which, according to the conclusions of the Council of Trent, had been written under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. De Rossi's enterprise, therefore, was meant for the beautiful souls. By this, he meant those who could appreciate the exposure of the errors of learned commentators. Indeed, he takes people like the Cardinal Gadgetan, Thomas de Wio Gadgetan, and people like Nicholas de Rira to task for some of their interpretations of Scripture. And so he writes, now, since the Syriac text was extolled for its antiquity and authenticity, it may be used to the great pleasure of beautiful souls for the clarification of certain passages which do indeed deserve the consideration. In another example, the elucidation of an expression in the Gospels by means of the Syriac text, in this time it was the case of the book of Ezra, leads him to write, now noble intellects value the discovery of the truth of any subject or the etymology of a holy word which was unknown to their recent predecessors, far above any other great joy. So he's always on the defensive, as you see, apologetic and defensive the whole way through. And that's the way he writes also in his Hebrew work. It's a feature. He knows that he's really treading, he's in a difficult world where any word could get him into enormous trouble. De Rossi was an autodidact, and like me, no expert in Syriac. But he did have a good philological sense as he went about his work at exposing the correctness of the Syriac version at the expense of the Vulgate. He was not the first one, but one of the pioneers who used the Peshitta as a litmus test, what the original text should have read. Though his observations were little fragments of simple philological or historical insights, they do offer the reader an opportunity to recast the Christian scripture in an Oriental context. Thus, for example, he was keen to show that the Syriac text never reproduces the translator's gloss, which usually appears in the Latin text, in the Vulgate. So if we look at text 4, this is de Rossi's 9th example. He gives us the example, Mark 5, verse 41, which in the Latin text, and here's the English translation, and he took the damsel by the hand and said to her, Talita kumi, which is, damsel, arise. And straightway the damsel arose and walked. The Syriac text reads, and he took the hand of the damsel and said to her, Talita kumi, damsel, arise. And in that moment, the damsel arose and walked. I have lengthened the quotation in order to illustrate the example discussed in the preceding passages in which the Syriac text omits the translator's gloss. So one could be tempted to interpret the absence of the glosses as a deliberate attempt on the part of the translator to avoid redundancies. One could argue that way. But de Rossi, however, and not unjustifiably, regarded the omission of the translator's glosses as proof that the Syriac text reflected the original saying. In other words, there had been no need to translate it because everybody understood it. In contrast, he pointed to Matthew 27:2, and when they were come to a place called Golgotha, that is to say, a place of the skull, the Syriac retained the clause of the place of a skull, as he writes, since it is not simply an addition of the translator, but rather a necessary explication of the text. And that's quite an insightful remark. Another passage that had aroused febrile exegetical activity was the verse in Matthew 27:9, in which the Vulgate seemed to be referring to the wrong prophet when it read, then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, and they accepted 30 pieces of silver and gave them for the potter's field. The problem, as de Rossi pointed out, is that it was Zechariah in chapter 11, verses 12 to 13, and not Jeremiah who stated, and I took the 30 pieces of silver and cast them into the treasury. With a marked degree of satisfaction, de Rossi cited the Syriac version, which conveniently omitted the name of the prophet and simply read, and then was fulfilled that which was spoken by the prophet. The observations ran across all kinds of little philological questions, where he introduces not only matters of grammar and syntax, but also pronunciation, as in the Eli lama sabachthani. On this renowned phrase, he not only notes that the Syriac reads il, God, God, without the pronoun, but the speakers of his Syriac do not say sabachthani, and I quote, still less zabachthani, as do the Jews nowadays when reading the Targum. Palestinian Jews, he states, citing Wittmanstätter, have a barbaric pronunciation of Aramaic. Syrians fuse the two letters and pronounce the word spaghtani, as we Italians might pronounce the word spara. I don't know if that's the case, but okay. In one of the appendices in his monograph, de Rossi undertook to examine the meaning of the word hypocrite, which occurs often in the Gospels, particularly in Matthew 23. Such an investigation was certainly not germane to his study. In fact, he admitted that the word is not Aramaic and speaks of a certain amount of diffidence in broaching such a well-known subject. I would like to suggest that lurking in the background is, to this uncalled for observation, is a Jewish apologia. He begins his investigation by consulting the indispensable reference work, Calapino's Latin Dictionary. Everybody was using that in the 16th century. There were many editions. The entry for hypocrite gives Boudet's definition, simulator alienae personae, in other words, a pretender. He then examined the Syriac version, which, according to his reading, consistently rendered the word hypocrite with the expression nasve kefe, carriers of stone. This term was clarified to de Rossi's satisfaction when he recalled the passage in the Talmud in Tractate Makot, in which 7 types of pretenders are described. One such person is called Parush Shichmi, which translated literally means shoulder Pharisee. According to the Palestinian Talmud, a shoulder Pharisee was someone who wished to give the impression of being overburdened by good works. De Rossi thus concluded that hypocrite, carrier of stones, and shoulder Pharisee describe one and the same person. Now, what was the point of this philological exercise about which de Rossi had initially expressed some reticence? I would like to propose that de Rossi was intentionally attempting to subvert a common pejorative interpretation of the word Pharisee, which had come to be used as a synonym for hypocrite. By indicating that the ancient sages, the opponents of the Sadducees, had themselves denounced hypocrisy, so the Pharisees or the rabbis in the Palestinian Talmud had denounced hypocrisy, calling them shoulder Pharisee, de Rossi could tactfully correct the misinterpretation and abuse of the term Pharisee in relation to his co-religionists. At this juncture, however, I have to inform you that de Rossi's knowledge of Syriac let him down at this point. And this was pointed out to me by Sebastian all those years ago. He made an elementary error, confusing the letter bet for the letter kaf. Unfortunately, the Syriac text does not read kefe but bafe. The Syriac translation of the word for hypocrite has nothing to do with stones or shoulders, but simply means to put on an appearance, i.e., to be a hypocrite. In your text 5, so de Rossi was really a beginner, but that doesn't, we all make mistakes, and many mistakes were made in all those languages that people were beginning to learn. And I think it's a question, not really so much, what's interesting is not so much the errors as what exactly they were trying to do when they were learning those languages. Now, the last text 5, which I'm not going to read out, but rather summarizes, I will rather summarize. In that text, de Rossi again contextualizes historically. He talks about Josephus, who clearly referred to the priestly vestments by their Aramaic designations. And then he talks about the supernatural events in the form of heavenly voices, which were also conveyed in Aramaic. So there are these passages in the Talmud which talk about heavenly voices coming and calling out to people in the time of the temple, and they are always in Aramaic. What he does here is that he cites Matthew 3:17, "This is my beloved son." And he brings out the Syriac text, but by not saying it so many words, he's actually trying to convey that the heavenly voice, i.e. God, spoke to Jesus in Aramaic. So we get a sense now that of the sacred nature of that language. Well, it wasn't Hebrew, but it was actually Aramaic, at least in the time of Jesus. As I've already indicated, de Rossi is always sensitive to the religious sensibilities of his readers, and yet his sense of his own Jewish identity is never forfeited. This becomes particularly manifest in an astonishing passage where de Rossi presents an exposition of some verses in Acts which appear to misquote the Hebrew Old Testament, while the readings in the Syriac version conform to that of the Hebrew. In introducing the topic, he wrote, "Furthermore, speaking as a sincere Jew, I must in all conscience maintain that in antiquity, Christians in stock and descent, that is, Christians of Gentile origin, were not called to the Mosaic law, which was only given to the Jews. Nevertheless, whether we like it or not, velimus nolimus, they did come close to it for the most part, and thus certainly deserve to be protected by God's clemency, which is in fact the case." This statement of de Rossi begs for interpretation and elucidation. To which Gentile Christians is he referring? Is it perhaps a reference to Luke, the author of Acts, who was Syrian by birth? Does it also carry an implicit reference to true Christians with no Jewish taint, in contrast to the new Christians of his own time, those who came from the Iberian Peninsula? Would inquisitors, cardinals, and papal officials have felt somewhat patronized? A committed Jew speaks of Christians who are protected by God because they come close to the Jewish scriptures. Moreover, he's certainly expressing Jewish ambivalence, velimus nolimus, about Christian use of the Old Testament. What is certain is that such a statement must have dashed any hope that inquisitors may still have nurtured with regard to the conversion of this great Jewish scholar. Yet de Rossi did know his readership and discreetly wove his variegated discourses in such a way as to inspire confidence. The conclusion to the tract reveals all. All this, in my view, is genuine proof that whoever tries to gain expertise in Syriac will find, and this without detriment to the Vulgate version, that the text contains good information and helpful wording. According to my understanding, Leo X of blessed memory had every reason to send a legation to Syria in order to bring back Syrians with a view to examining their texts. It must be admitted that de Rossi knew how to sell his goods. His statement, written at the time when the Cardinal of Santa Severina was seeking submission of the Eastern churches to Rome's authority and was overseeing the Latin translation of the Jacobite Missal, was opportunistic. De Rossi's invocation of a seminal moment in the history of relations between the Oriental churches and the Santa Sede most certainly touched a chord. What is more, he ensured, or tried to ensure, that the Vulgate that had been and continued to be the subject of vociferous debate, but had been declared in 1546 as the authentic text of Scripture, somehow remained inviolate. Critique did not signify debunking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. That was fascinating. My impression, Joanna, is that Azariah had a much better knowledge of Syriac, or attained a much better knowledge of Syriac, than most of the Christian Syriacists of the period. I think knowing Jewish Aramaic is a great help. I know when I've had Jewish students reading Syriac, they read it very fast, rather inaccurately, and full of guesswork, but often the guesswork is quite intelligent. So I think he probably had a good start in his in the way he approached Syriac. Does he ever deal with grammatical points or differences between Syriac and
he really thought it was exactly the same language, which they all did, really, without exception.
Yes.
I think perhaps the exception was Tremelius, Emmanuel Tremelius. I think he didn't, but the rest they didn't. I'm sure you're right. I'm sure that probably he had more mastery just simply because of that fluency in Jewish Aramaic. That's for certain. And it's quite clear that people like Tesio Ambrogio and they're just messing about. And I mean, they're not really dealing with a text. And anyway, he's got other ideas. And I mean that grammar of his you can't use. It's completely and Widmanstätter, obviously, as you yourself have said, Moses of Mardin did the actual editing, the actual textual side of things. Okay, Widmanstätter, of course, contributed with the plates, with the kind of Kabbalistic, Sephirotic kind of. I think it's supposed to be an almond shape with a Sephirotic tree in the middle and the crucifixion of Jesus opposite. I mean, those kind of things are nothing to do with Syriac, are to do with Widmanstätter's own interest in Kabbalah. So it's a strange, it is a beginning. What we're seeing is a combination of people coming together, and you've got the people coming like Moses Abani, who did know his own language, and people like Wittgenstein, who didn't know, but who and came with other kinds of ideas. But they certainly, I think they were all sort of motivated by the desire there was a certainty that this text was of antiquity. What's interesting, I found with de Rossi, is that he was quite critical. He doesn't say it's the original. He says it's a translation, and he's really actually seeming to say, against other people, that it's not from Aramaic, or that it probably the Greek text. To go back to the question of the previous speaker, that it's not Aramaic or even Hebrew, and he knew the stories about the fact that Matthew, at least, was that they were all looking for the original Matthew. So he remains very conservative in his position. And I found that actually very interesting, against the current of ecstasy about finding the original Matthew, at least.
Yes, because in the Syriac manuscripts of the Gospels, each Gospel has a little colophon, which is also found in Greek often. And then for Matthew, it says written in Hebrew, in wherever it was, I forget. So there's a strong temptation on the part of readers to believe that, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, he remains his own person there. Quite interesting me. Yeah. He died too soon, so we can know what he would have done after that.
Yes. I remember when I was working on this period for popular book, I read all the colophons of Moses of Modin. That's fascinating because it was printed, of course, over quite a long period. And the Gospels get their colophon, and then Acts and Epistles later on. And the first colophon, it really indicates that Moses did all the work, and which I'm sure was true.
Yeah.
But the next one, clearly, Wittgenstein had read it. I mean, he certainly did know some Syriac, and no doubt he got Moses to translate anything he couldn't cope with. He'd obviously complained. And so in the second colophon, you get much more about Wittgenstein and his family and his daughters and so on. It's fascinating.
Right.
And and right at the end, Moses says, and I did a lot too.
And I did a
lot too. I worked very hard too. So, just to make the point.
Yeah. I think what it brings out is the collaboration of people from the very interesting collaboration of people from completely different worlds.
Yes.
And that, I think, is a feature of this period. In the 16th century, 17th century, you're getting colleagues, and you just don't know what the relationship is between them, who's doing the bulk of, but there is cooperation that stands behind these monumental works of scholarship that are being produced. And we know only a fraction of what was happening behind those closed doors.
Yes, and the interest in Syriac was really through the Maronites in Rome. And but for them, Syriac scholarship would not have had its little birth in 16th century Europe, probably.
Right.
So it's very much up to these minorities, people in the background, who really stir things up.
Yes.
Thank you, Joanna, so much for this really fascinating episode. We're most grateful to you, and thank you, all the audience, listeners. We have our next meeting on the 15th of January, and it's Alberto Rigolio, and his title, I forget the exact title, he's going to talk about Ephraim and the beginning of, or new beginnings of Syriac poetry. So this will be a very intriguing episode. So until then, thank you, everyone, and thank you in particular to Joanna and to Thea for organizing it all. So
thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.